The Rings of Power is Amazon Prime's first attempt to take us back to the world of Middle-earth and to tell us the stories of J.R.R. Tolkien, and it struggles.
Up your sword.
Without it, what am I to be?
Now, that's not to say that everything about this season is bad. There are actually some things that I really enjoyed about it, to the point where I feel like this show has the potential to become something really cool. They just need to listen to the criticisms of Season 1 and use it to help them with Season 2, because they've got some potential and some good stuff going on here. For one thing, the show visually looks amazing. It feels like a movie. It does feel like you're in this Middle-earth as far as the design of everything. The places that you get to see, such as Lindon, Numenor, Rhegion, all of them look amazing. And I love the design. I also like the fact that you got to see all these new places that we didn't see in Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. And so I love the fact that you get different parts of Middle-earth in this show. As far as the design of the look of the characters, I was a bit divided on some of them. I didn't love the way that they always had the elves. I'm kind of a little bit biased towards the fact that I like the way that Jackson displayed them. But for the most part, I thought the armor and the design of the characters looked pretty good, and it worked for what they were trying to tell in this unique version that they were giving us. Another thing that I actually really like about this series as well is I think that they had some creative ideas. Now, one of the issues with this show is that if you're interested in watching Tolkien stories, they don't really tell Tolkien stories. They have elements that you can see where they borrowed from Tolkien stories, but other than that, it's mainly just them doing their own thing with it. And that can be very, very disappointing, and it was disappointing for me, because Tolkien stories are better, for one thing, and I would have liked to have seen those. But you don't always get them, but I do think that they did have some creative things. For instance, in this season, there are two main parts that are kind of the big elements of the season. One of them occurs semi in the middle of this show, and then the other one occurs at the very end, involving the Rings of Power. The issue that I had with these is I thought that they were great ideas, and I think that they were the good points to have in Season 1, but I feel like the first one was dragged out for way too long. It takes it nearly 6 episodes before it actually happens. And then the last one, the Rings of Power themselves, which should have been the focus of the entire season, gets squished into like the last episode. And so that was very, very disappointing. But they were good points. They just didn't really display them well enough. They didn't really have it laid out in a way that it was entertaining to watch. That's also one of the issues that I have with this show, is it feels really slow. There are some episodes that I just didn't find myself enjoying. One, because of the way that it doesn't properly display Tolkien, and two, because it takes so long for things to get going. I mean, it's all the way till episode 6 before you get a significant action scene, and that was very, very disappointing. That should have been moved earlier. Some of this stuff should have been sped up, and more focus should have been given to the Rings of Power themselves and the parts that were actually Tolkien lore. So that was a disappointment for me. Another thing with this show that was both a disappointment as well as something that I think they somewhat succeeded at is the characters themselves. Now, there are a mix of both characters that are Tolkien's characters in this show, as well as a mix of characters that are completely made up. And what I found was kind of interesting is that I actually, for the most part, enjoyed the made-up characters more than I enjoyed the actual Tolkien characters. And I think the reason for that is because when it comes to the Tolkien characters like Galadriel in particular, or even Isildur, but I think Isildur improves a little bit as the season goes along. There's pre-existing stories with them. There's ideas of who those characters are supposed to be, and it just didn't feel to me like they portrayed the characters in the way that Tolkien had previously written them, and so they proved more disappointing. Where in regards to characters that were new, that we had never seen before, that were entirely made up, you have a clean slate with those. You can do whatever you want. You can make some creative stuff up with them, and so I really enjoyed them. I liked the character of Arondir, for instance, the elf. I liked his storyline. I liked the idea of where he came from. It made sense to me, and it made for an interesting, he had one of the more clear and better storylines of the whole season as well. Another character that I really enjoyed was Adar, who's kind of the primary antagonist of this season up until you get to the very end. And I thought what they did with him was creative. I thought it was a good idea. And so that's kind of where the frustration for this season comes, is the fact that there are some very good ideas in here. And there are some very good story points that they could have told. They just struggle telling them in every way except for visually. Visually, they're able to tell it in a wonderful way. Another thing that they also really kind of struggle with in this season is the action. There are some decent action scenes, but for the most part, they just didn't feel super realistic. They felt more staged and planned out than they did feel like actual brutal fights that were happening, like what we get in Jackson's version of the Lord of the Rings. Now, I made a few mentions to Jackson's Lord of the Rings, and I think that that trilogy, and the fact that that trilogy is amazing, is also something that kind of hurt, in my opinion, of the Rings of Power, because the Rings of Power is nowhere near the same quality. It's a different interpretation, and I liked it for a lot of different things, but when you compare it back to what we've seen before, it just feels very unfortunate because of what we've seen that Middle-earth can be. And so that's definitely a struggle for this series, is they did have to try and overcome the fact that Jackson's already killed it in this area, and I don't think that they quite did that. I think that they struggled with it, and I think a lot of this show struggled in the most part with just telling their stories. I think telling the story was the biggest issue that they had, and I think that telling characters that were compelling, there are certain characters in this show, for instance, a character like Gilgalad, who is supposed to be super awesome. Like in the books, he's an amazing character. He's kind of a jerk in this one. And there are some parts where you understand why he's acting the way that he is, but I just didn't really care for that portrayal of him. And so there's a lot of things that like that where I'm just like, okay, didn't like it. I didn't like the way that you portrayed it. I didn't like the way that you're telling that story. I didn't like the fact that you changed that story. So it's a very disappointing thing for me. But I'll tell you the one thing that really stands out to me in the show, the one thing that I absolutely love and makes me hope that we get more of this. And that's the fact that this is a clean fantasy series. There's really nothing in here that you need to worry about except for the violence. And there are some parts that can be decently brutal and gory in this season, so you have to watch for that. But other than that, you don't have to worry about swearing. You don't have to worry about sex and nudity. There's a little bit of, I guess you could say, drinking in there, but it's not anything significant. So it's a very clean fantasy show, which is something that we just don't get enough these days. All of the current shows coming out, like House of the Dragon, you had Wheel of Time that came out a little while back ago. Those all have their problems. Those all have sex. They all have nudity. They all have these things that I don't enjoy in my fantasy. And I like the fact that this show, maybe they didn't keep Tolkien's stories, maybe they didn't deliver on his characters, but they at least kept the fact that he had a clean fantasy series, and I enjoyed that I didn't have to worry about that while watching this. So I hope we do get a season 2. I hope that they're able to improve on all the things that they messed up with in season 1, but I hope that they keep that same kind of tone, that same cleanliness to it, because it always makes a show so much better when that stuff is not within it. But overall, guys, like I mentioned, this is a very difficult series. It's a very challenging one to kind of grade because there are things that I really like about it, and I hope they'll be able to continue on those. And then at the same time, there are things that really bothered me with it. But in the end, I'm going to go ahead and give this one a C+. Again, pretty middle of the road. It's kind of your standard fantasy show. It doesn't stick out as anything amazing. So I'm going to give it that C, but I do think it leans more towards the positive. I think it has more potential than what a lot of people are giving it credit for. So I'm going to do the C+. I think that it has the chance to deliver something really cool in season 2. But anyways, guys, have you had the opportunity to watch Rings of Power? If you have, let us know down in the comments what you thought, and be sure to look forward to new reviews coming soon.